Hey guys, hope you found the week-long period of recalibration for educational equity useful and are ready to get back to class. So I know I am going a little nuts over here. Today we're going to be talking about sexual harassment, and next time we'll be talking about the gender wage gap. Um, Started, I want to begin with a little preamble or disclaimer. I know this stuff can be really uncomfortable to discuss, and it can be uncomfortable to discuss partly because it involves talking about sex, and people don't always love talking about sex, at least not in a classroom. And but more importantly, it can be uncomfortable to discuss, I think, especially for men and boys, because it can feel like you're under attack or like the discussion is excessively critical. And this is tricky. I don't want men and boys in the class to just sort of plug their ears or tune out, or to just feel like they're being excessively criticized or excessively judged. So, what do you do about that? Well, um, one thing to say that I think can be helpful in this context is this. So, while sexual harassment and gender based employment discrimination are problems that disproportionately affect women, it's important to remember that to a great extent, the underlying cause of these things, what brings these things about, this sort of deeper social problem, is the way our society thinks about gender and the roles it assigns to girls and boys. So, this underlying sort of ideology or set of practices surrounding the differences between boys and girls harms men too. It harms men and boys too. So this isn't always obvious, or this isn't always as discussed very widely, but men are the victims of the majority of violent crimes. So every violent crime except for uh, uh, sex crimes and domestic violence has majority male victims. Nearly 80% of murder victims and suicide victims are men. More than 90% of incarcerated people in the United States are men. And sort of in a less quantifiable, but I think still very real way, norms of emotional expression that encourage men to be to suppress or hide emotions other than, let's say, anger, uh, deprive men of emotionally rich lives. So I think there are all sorts of ways in which the ideology of gender in the United States in 2020 and in many other societies around the world harms both men and women, girls and boys. So it might seem like this week is just open season on men and boys, but what we're talking about are symptoms of deeper problems that hurt men and boys too. Okay, so end rant. So much for my preamble or disclaimer. So I think one place to start here in talking about sexual harassment is to talk about the two types of sexual harassment which are acknowledged by the law. So the first type is what's called hostile environment or hostile workplace sexual harassment. So if you have a boss who repeatedly touches you, who say rubs your shoulders or touches your butt or your breasts or your genitals or something like that, that would be physical. That would be a sort of physical cause of a hostile workplace. But this could also be a verbal thing. So uh, putting up pornographic images on an office wall, or talking about your own genitals, talking about porn you watch, talking about women you're attracted to in graphic detail, making unwanted sexual advances, uh, uh, and so this can take, I think, some more sort of obvious or extreme forms. You know, if somebody's going around, talking about their penis all the time, you can kind of tell that, well, this is inappropriate. But it can also take, I think, some subtler and uh, harder to recognize forms. So you might find that You have a boss who refers to all of his male employees by, say, their first names, or, buddy or something like that, but refers to women exclusively using sort of diminutive names, talking to them the way that you might talk to uh, a, uh, a young child, or maybe the way that you would talk to, like, your own romantic partner. So systematically calling women in your workplace baby or sweetie or honey or something like that, or doll, whatever, rather than referring to them by their own names or talking about them in the same way that you would talk about your male coworkers or male subordinates. Um, I think complimenting people's on their appearances. Uh, of course, it's, this is there. You get into some gray areas here. Um, it's not, of course, necessarily sexual harassment if somebody tells you they like your haircut or you're wearing a cool shirt or something like that. But uh, there are ways in which, if people are especially if people are sort of systematically discuss the appearances of women in the workplace, but don't discuss the appearances of men, if they discuss your appearance in ways that make people uncomfortable, or that have the effect of reminding women that they're sort of always being sexually judged, or always being considered as sort of possible sexual partners, or considered for their appearance rather than for their performance on the job, then you've got a problem. So it can be hard to tell the difference between, an innocuous, non-harassy remark about somebody's, cool haircut, and I'm not asking for a compliment about my haircut, but whatever. And a sort of systematic way of talking about women in terms of their appearance that sort of undermines the value of the work they do, and sort of constantly reminds them that they're not being treated in the same way as men in the workplace. Okay, so you can have a hostile workplace. A workplace where there's repeated unwanted touching or inappropriate touching, or where there are these sort of verbal markers of a hostile workplace. You can also have what are called what's called quid pro quo sexual harassment, which means like, which for which, or this for that, sexual harassment, when somebody offers you sexual favors in exchange for offers you a job in exchange, or a promotion, or some sort of employment perk in exchange for a sexual favor or a date, or something like that. So this is, I think, easier to recognize. So if you have a boss who says they'll give you a promotion or consider you for a promotion if you kiss them or do something more intimate than that, then you've got quid pro quo sexual harassment on your hands, when people are trading sexual favors or dates for employment opportunities. Okay, so these are the two types of sexual harassment which are acknowledged by the law. But you might ask, does the law get things right? Does the law acknowledge all of the types of sexual harassment which are real? And Superson, in the piece on the feminist definition of sexual harassment, argues no. She argues that this legal doctrine that sexual harassment is always hostile workplace related or quid pro quo, she thinks this is too narrow. And the main reason she thinks it's too narrow, in a nutshell, is that she thinks it doesn't account for what she calls the social nature of sexual harassment. The whole system of subtle ways in which sexual harassment harms all women, not just its immediate victims. So, if somebody touches your butt on the job and you don't want them to, or maybe you don't mind, but if they still inappropriately touch your butt on the job, this is the most obvious victim is the person whose butt is being touched, right? They're the person who's being made uncomfortable or being sort of put in their place. But Superson argues that all women or perhaps all women in a culture, or all women in the workplace, or something like that, are being harmed in this case. So why would you say that? Why would you say that sexual harassment with one sort of obvious victim, the person who's being made uncomfortable, why would you say that that it has all of these sort of more diffuse victims? It harms all women everywhere, or all women in the society, or all women in the workplace, or something like that? Well, Superson says a lot about this, but to just boil it down a little bit, or to briefly explain it, she writes, sexual harassment is integrally related to sex roles. It reveals the belief that a person is to be relegated to certain roles on the basis of her sex, including not only women's being sex objects, but also their being caretakers, motherers, nurturers, sympathizers, etc. In general, the sex roles women are relegated to are associated with the body as opposed to the mind, and emotions as opposed to reason. So, to the extent that sexual harassment sort of reminds women everywhere that they are only being considered in terms of their bodies, or only being considered in terms of their performance of certain sex roles, which are, or gender roles, which are associated with the with being a woman. So roles of nurturing or mothering or caretaking, as opposed to the role that they might be doing on their job. If a woman is working in a factory, whether she's a caretaker or a nurturer is besides the point. That's not the role she's performing there. That's not her job there. Okay. So sexual harassment sort of can reveal a belief in, and so perpetuate these sorts of sex roles and the sort of expectations about what is normal and natural and appropriate to expect from women, and what's normal and natural and appropriate in terms of how we evaluate women. Okay. Um, I'll add that individual acts of sexual harassment also, I hope this is a little bit clearer, frankly, but individual acts of sexual harassment also contribute to a culture in which harassment is expected and accepted. So we have the, so if somebody catcalls woman who's walking down the street, and everybody around can see it, little boys walking around can see it, and that sort of thing. This contributes to a sort of general expectation that this is a normal thing to do, and that women should expect to be catcalled, and that if this is just sort of the way things work in our society, then it's not something that we should complain about. It's not something that we should fight against. It's normal and natural. So, we have sort of tropes or sayings or little ideas which, like the motorcycle guys outside. Is this happening in your neighborhood too? Like, the motorcycle guys are like out in full force. They're going up and down Flatbush Avenue. Okay, motorcycle guys. Okay, they're done. So we have some kind of stock sayings or phrases which you hear trotted out again and again, that boys will be boys. So you just have to expect that men are going to catcall or grab women's butts or something like that, or that she was asking for it. So if somebody's catcalled, maybe we think that's because she should have known that she was going to be catcalled, because it's normal and natural and to be expected. So any individual act of sexual harassment, to the extent that it contributes to a culture in which harassment is expected and accepted, will harm women everywhere, or women throughout the culture, not just the immediate victim of the person who's directly harassed or made uncomfortable. Okay. Superson draws a distinction between subjective and objective definitions of sexual harassment. So subjective and she is going to argue for an objective definition. A subjective definition of sexual harassment requires that sexual harassment be unwelcome or annoying to the victim. And so Superson has two arguments against these, at least two arguments, against subjective definitions of sexual harassment. First, she says, this puts the burden of proof on the victim to show that she didn't want to be harassed. Maybe you like having your butt touched by your romantic partner, and so how do you know that you didn't like having your butt touched by your boss or your coworker or something like that? So the so when we require by definition that sexual harassment be unwelcome or annoying, we require women who are victims of sexual harassment to show that they found it unwelcome or annoying. Also, another problem with these subjective definitions of sexual harassment is that if we focus on the unwelcomeness or the annoyingness to the immediate victim, then we're ignoring these social harms, ways in which individual acts of sexual harassment can contribute. Oh, hey there. Scrapple. What's going on, Scrapple? Here, can I pick up the boy? What? Can I pick up the boy? Okay. Hold on. It's your daily Scrapple. Oh, where we go? Where we go? Here's Scrapple. He went for a walk. He's a very sweet boy, and he smells pretty bad. Okay. So, subjective definitions of sexual harassment focus on the unwelcomeness or annoyingness of sexual harassment, right? But that leaves out the social harms to people who aren't necessarily annoyed by any particular act of sexual harassment, but are, say, harmed by being in a culture in which harassment is expected and accepted, or harmed by being in a culture where the gender roles that are available to women are sort of limiting or going to make your life harder in, say, the workplace. Okay, as Superson points out, you can have harassing behavior that is actually welcome. So, it's uncomfortable to talk about this, but some women do actually like to be catcalled. So she gives the example of the woman in Daytona Beach who, she walked around the beach. She's a conventionally beautiful woman, and as she's walking down the beach, people would whistle at her and talk about her body and stuff like that. That can be nice. That can be flattering. You can think, oh, well, people think I'm sexy. People think I'm attractive. People want to sleep with me. That can be flattering. That can make you feel good about yourself, and so that could be nice. Other people might be annoyed by it, but this particular woman, so it seemed to Superson, was not annoyed by it. So you think, well, so then it's no problem. But it's like, no, it is a problem because just because this one woman finds her catcallers perfectly friendly and doesn't mind it at all. She doesn't find this behavior unwelcome or annoying. Other women everywhere have to live in this culture in which catcalling is expected and accepted, and they might not like it. I think most women don't like being catcalled. So even individual acts of sexual harassment, it's a consequence of subjective definitions of sexual harassment that individual acts of sexual harassment have to be unwelcome or annoying. But this has the undesirable consequence that you can't, no matter how much you catcall somebody who likes it, it's not sexually harassing. No matter how much this negatively affects women sort of outside of that particular individual. Okay. Superson writes, according to the objective view defended here, what is decisive in determining whether behavior constitutes SH, sexual harassment, is not whether the victim is bothered, but whether the behavior is an instance of a practice that expresses and perpetuates the attitude that the victim and members of her sex are inferior because of their sex. Thus, the Daytona Beach case counts as a case of sexual harassment because the behavior is an instance of a practice that reflects men's domination of women in that it relegates women to the role of sex objects. Okay, this is a bit of a mouthful, but it's a kind of hinting at the definition of sexual harassment, which Superson comes to. Here's Superson's definition of sexual harassment. She says, any behavior, it's an objective definition, a definition that doesn't require that sexual harassment be unwelcome or annoying. She writes, any behavior, verbal or physical, caused by a person A in the dominant class, directed at another, B, in the subjugated class, that is the oppressed class, the class with less power, that expresses and perpetuates the attitude that B or members of B's sex is or are inferior because of their sex, thereby causing harm to either B and or members of B's sex. Okay, so you have a dominant class, which in a society where men are the dominant sex, that's going to be men, and you have a subjugated class, which in a patriarchal society is going to be women, that expresses and perpetuates the attitude. Expressing the attitude, that means showing that you have it, revealing your attitudes, revealing your beliefs, showing what you really think or feel, and perpetuating the attitude, that is, say, encouraging the attitude, making it normal, making it accepted and expected. That B or members of B's sex are inferior because of their sex, which is harmful. Okay, so if I say something that expresses the belief that some woman is inferior because of her sex, or that women in general are inferior because of their sex, or if I say something that perpetuates that attitude, that makes that attitude more accepted and more normal, then I'm sexually harassing somebody. And it could be verbal or physical. So it could be something I say, but it could also be touching somebody. So if I don't routinely touch my male coworkers on the butt, then and I always touch my female coworkers on the butt, then I'm sort of expressing and perpetuating the attitude that it's sort of women's bodies are just sort of available to me in a way that men's bodies aren't, and I'm making it sort of seem like a normal thing. I'm perpetuating the attitude, saying, "Hey, yeah, anybody can do this." Okay. So let's see how this definition would sort of apply in a particular case. So take a typical example of workplace sexual harassment. Somebody repeatedly making lewd remarks and sexual advances on a coworker, and she declines. How does this express and perpetuate the attitude that the coworker, is inferior because of her sex? Well, it expresses the attitude that women aren't coworkers, or to be treated as equals, that they exist for male sexual gratification. So, there's a kind of respect or dignity or equality that's wrapped up in being treated as competent at your job and being evaluated for the job that you're doing on the basis of the work that you're doing. And when we repeatedly make sexual advances or lewd remarks about a coworker, we say, yeah, you're a coworker, but you're not really here for your work. You're here for my sexual gratification. Okay. At this point, I think it's important to raise at least one objection. Maybe you have other objections to Superson's definition, but I think that it's important to raise at least one objection here, which is that, okay, while the vast majority of victims of sexual harassment are women and girls, men and boys can also be sexually harassed. There was a coffee shop in my old neighborhood that I used to go to, and the guy who ran the coffee shop was just constantly just rubbing and touching his male employees, just patting them on the butt, rubbing their shoulders. It was just it made me so fucking uncomfortable. It was just so obviously he didn't do this with women. It was just so obviously inappropriate. I mean, it's this cramped kitchen. Imagine that you're working in like a cramped kitchen at this very busy coffee shop. They had they made food. They made a lot of food. So, it was hot. It was very active kitchen, so on and so forth. And like, imagine that you have to do that and just have your boss just grabbing your ass every 5 minutes, or you never know when your boss is going to grab your ass. So you're sort of constantly on guard, you know. That's sexual harassment, if anything is, and it's sexual harassment of men. That was the victims of this were men. But if men are the dominant class in Superson's definition, it's not clear how it would be possible to sexually harass men. So Superson's theory seems to, at least without some kind of elaboration, seems to have the consequence that it's impossible to sexually harass men. But of course, it is possible to sexually harass men. I think the answer is that, you know, Superson's definition of sexual harassment is not quite right. But her insight is her basic insight is very real. Some of the harms of sexual harassment are to the individual victim, but some are to women everywhere. And you know, perhaps even in the case of the you know, the boss who at the coffee shop who's repeatedly grabbing male employees' asses, it's creating an environment in the workplace that's bad for men throughout the workplace, even the men who aren't immediately being touched. So, you know, there might be a guy who works there whose ass is never grabbed, whose shoulders are never rubbed, but he's sort of constantly on guard because that's the kind of workplace he's in, and it's something he's watching out for. Okay. So Superson's definition, to the extent that it has the consequence, and it looks like it does, that it has the consequence that it's impossible to sexually harass men, Superson's definition is wrong. But the basic insight that the definition is built on, that a lot of the harms of sexual harassment don't have to do with the individual victim finding the harassment annoying or unwelcome. They also have to do with sort of creating perpetuating harmful gender roles and creating a culture in which harassment is expected and accepted. You know, these are some of the real harms of sexual harassment. You know, Superson is right. Okay. Okay. So the question is, what do you do? So what do you do? And you know, this is a business ethics class, so we're not necessarily interested in how would we solve sexual harassment sort of throughout the society as a whole. We're interested in what you can do from a managerial point of view to get sexual harassment under control. And I think it's worth I think it's worth thinking about before we consider the solutions. Well, why is it hard? Why is this a hard problem to solve? What makes sexual harassment so thorny and so difficult to get rid of? I think there are a few reasons. You know, maybe this list could go on, but here we go. So there might be an excessively high burden of proof on accusers. So women who are victims of sexual harassment sometimes have to prove things which are really hard to prove, like that you didn't want to be harassed. So, you know, especially if you sort of, yeah, okay. So you have to prove things about sort of what's going on in your mind. You have to prove things about your appearance and sort of what, you know, you have to prove that you didn't sort of send off subtle signals that this is what you were asking for. You know, this is a high burden of proof. So one reason why sexual harassment is a hard problem to solve is that victims of sexual harassment are sort of asked to provide evidence, which it's often impossible to provide. As Cliff points out in the Me Too piece, a lot of the most common occupations for women are positions which are subordinate to typically male positions. So women are the majority of elementary school teachers, but men are the majority of principals. Women are the majority of nurses, and men the majority of doctors. Women are the secretaries, men are the administrators, you know, stereotypically at least. And so, you know, women are put in just given the sort of jobs that women tend to have, they tend to be subordinate to men in positions of power. And sexual harassment is more common when there's a man in a position of power over a woman. There are also occupations. The most common occupations are also occupations that require a lot of pleasantness and agreeableness. So, think about being a nurse or a home health aide or something like that, or a secretary. You know, what makes a good secretary? Well, you want somebody who's pleasant, who's friendly, who's inviting, who's easy to talk to, who doesn't make your life unnecessarily difficult, and so on. And so, you know, um, if your job requires you to be pleasant and agreeable, and somebody sexually harasses you, well, what you might think of as the normal or natural response, or the response that's going to show in a court that you really didn't want it, is going to be disincentivized by your job. So you're going to have to say, no, you can't do that. That's obnoxious. You're harassing me. You're going to have to be uh, unpleasant and disagreeable. You're going to have to take on these sorts of behaviors or roles which don't fit neatly both with the workplace job description and with the sort of general gender role or gendered expectation that women be pleasant and agreeable. Okay. So there's the belief that this came up when we were talking about the difference between subjective and object definitions of sexual harassment. But there's the belief, one reason why sexual harassment is such a thorny and intractable problem is that there's the widespread belief that it's only sexual harassment if victims protest, right? So, imagine that your boss, keeps asking you out on a date, or keeps talking about your breasts in ways that make you really uncomfortable. Well, you could say, hey, buddy, go fuck yourself. But, it's your boss, so, that seems like a really dangerous thing to do. So what do? Well, maybe you just sort of, laugh it off. You say, yeah, sure, yeah, my breasts are great, whatever. Or you sort of deflect, and you sort of change the topic. You keep your distance, but you never outwardly say, no, stop it. Well, after the fact, this sort of seems like evidence to a lot of people that you must have really liked it, or it must not really have been so serious because you didn't protest at the time. But it's hard to protest when your boss is doing this stuff. Okay. Continuing on, there's one reason why sexual harassment can be such a thorny problem is that there's a widespread misunderstanding about what counts as sexual harassment. So, as Superson argues that our legal definition of sexual harassment isn't expansive enough or doesn't cover, enough cases. But even among legal sexual harassment, there's misunderstanding about what counts as creating a hostile workplace, right? You might think, oh, well, no, I was just complimenting. I just put up some porn on an office wall. What's wrong with that? I didn't touch anybody. Some people might think that sexual harassment has to be physical, or they might think that sexual harassment has to be overtly mean. So if you're saying something that sounds nice on the face of it, talking about, oh, hey, you've got beautiful breasts, or hey, sweetie, hey, honey, hey, baby, something like that. This can sound nice superficially. So there could be misunderstanding about what counts as sexual harassment because you think sexual harassment has to be sort of obviously or overtly mean or menacing or intimidating. Okay. There can also be, in addition to sort of misunderstanding about what counts as sexual harassment, I think it's fair to say that there are some genuinely borderline cases. How many times does somebody have to call you baby before it counts as sexual harassment? As a friend pointed out to me once, when the guys at the pizza, a female friend, when the guys at the pizza place call me baby, it's, oh, well, that can feel sort of nice, for whatever reason. But if my fucking boss called me baby, it would be, ugh, that's gross. So it's like, well, okay, so it's okay when the pizza place guys do it, but it's not okay when the boss does it. But there's are perhaps some sort of in between cases. Say you're you have a friendly relationship with a supplier at a company and they call you baby, or you work at a restaurant and a regular customer calls you honey or sweetie. It depends on the tone of voice. It depends on whether this contributes to a culture in which this is regarded as accepted and expected. It depends on whether they're relegating you to a social role which sort of isn't appropriate for the workplace. It depends in these subtle ways. So there can be some genuine uncertainty or unclarity, or borderline cases, some vagueness about what counts as sexual harassment. Okay. Women who accuse men of sexual harassment are often stigmatized. They It's unpopular. It's unpopular to accuse people of sexual harassment. It's one reason why it's a hard problem to solve. Businesses can try to preserve their reputations. They don't want to be thought of as having a culture of sexual harassment. So, we talk about this. We've talked about this a lot in the last few years as a result of, hey, Scrapple, what's the matter? What's the matter, baby? See, it's okay if I call the dog baby, but he's my baby boy. Okay. We've talked a lot about this in the last few years as a result of Me Too, but when businesses settle sexual harassment claims with employees, they might have a non-disclosure agreement, an NDA, which prevents employees from speaking out about sexual harassment, which can make future victims of sexual harassment at the workplace feel sort of disempowered, or like they're alone, like they have nobody they can go to. If they didn't have an NDA and women at the workplace were able to speak out, they'd say, oh, no, this isn't just me. This is a problem that's facing other people as well. Okay. Sexual harassment often takes place in private, or it can be covert stuff. There aren't necessarily recordings of every conversation or every inappropriate touch. I think that can make it hard. I guess this goes under stigmatizing accusers as well, but there's sort of fear of retaliation. So if you speak up about sexual harassment, are you going to be fired? Are you not going to get the promotion? Are you going to be seen as difficult? Okay. So there are a lot of reasons why sexual harassment can be a difficult problem to solve. But there are honest-to-God solutions, and there are things you can do as a worker, and there are things managers can do to help deal with sexual harassment. So individual workers can go to HR. They can go to human resources. Managers can create third-party, sometimes HR departments are sort of independent of the rest of a firm, or they're third-party contractors or something like that. So you can bring in sort of third parties as a manager to help adjudicate claims of sexual harassment. So they don't have skin in the game. They're not trying to preserve the reputation of the business. So at least ideally, and so they can be a sort of fair, impartial judge of whether sexual harassment has taken place. If it's your boss, this is part of the problem, right? If it's your boss that's sexually harassing you, well, your boss is who you're usually supposed to go to with your workplace problems. You go to your boss's boss, but isn't that sort of going outside the chain of command? And maybe your boss's boss has a relationship with your boss, and so on. So bringing in third parties, bringing in sort of independent or impartial judges going to HR might be helpful. But HR departments often work really for management, even if they're supposed to be kind of objective or impartial. So groups that seem like they might be impartial third parties can sometimes not be. So that's a problem. Individual workers can unionize. So maybe you don't have an individual worker doesn't have the legal resources or the just kind of the bravery to deal with all of the turmoil that comes from making a sexual harassment allegation. But if you're unionized, you can get the legal resources of the union. You can get the support of other members of the union, so you don't have to go through it alone. So individual workers can unionize. Management in general won't be encouraging workers to unionize, but so this isn't a managerial solution, but it's a solution for individual workers. Okay. You can try to keep track of hard evidence of these things. So you can require sort of transparency in office communication. You could put cameras around the office. Now, this could feel like surveillance, and this might lead to a sort of general culture of distrust within a firm. So that has its own downsides too. But individual workers can at least try to keep track of the paper trail or try to document sexual harassment when it happens. Okay. You can create a culture where witnesses feel they are capable, and witnesses and victims feel capable of and encouraged of speaking to speak up. Um, so you might have a sort of open door policy as a manager and say, hey, anytime you want to come in with any kind of complaint, any we're going to listen. You can sort of make an you can open up opportunities for anonymous complaints. If you have meetings, you can ask for people to offer their complaints. Don't just sort of allow people to make complaints. You can solicit their complaints or their moral concerns, their grievances. And this is going to come up again and again, not just in the context of sexual harassment, but in the context of other sort of workplace moral problems. Sort of making clear that you are interested in people's moral concerns, and you're interested in, and that you're going to take those concerns seriously. You're going to act on them. So you don't want to just allow people to raise complaints or raise their moral concerns. You want them to you want to invite them to do so, and you want to show that there's going to be some follow through. So, if you have some kind of, if some complaint leads to consequences that are beneficial to the complainant, you can show that. You can advertise that in internal communication to other workers. Okay. You can have clear and explicit standards. And lastly, I think this is important, you can have clear and explicit standards for what counts as sexual harassment. So you, again, you don't want to just expect, and we talked about this when we talked about conflict of interest, you don't want to just sort of assume that workers share your understanding of what counts as sexual harassment. So put it in the employee handbook, reinforce the employee handbook through training, or tests on the job, or referring to the employee handbook periodically rather than just sort of handing it out and never talking about it again. So you have a handbook that describes clearly what a wide range of sexual harassment, types of sexual harassment look like, that make clear what the repercussions for sexual harassment are going to be. Okay, so it's a thorny problem. It's a difficult problem. I'll add. Okay, this is this is actually relevant. So, if you're in a workplace where one last solution. So, if you're in a workplace where management is all male, and all of the female workers are subordinate staff, they're all employees. That's going to make it less likely that you have people who have personal experience with sexual harassment in management, people who for whom sexual harassment is a sort of a personally important issue. So having women in positions of management who are, helping write the codes of conduct, who are helping make decisions about how complaints are heard or managed. Putting women in positions of power in the workplace can also just show in general that women aren't supposed to be subordinate at the workplace. They aren't supposed to be beneath men in the workplace. Being equitable in your hiring and promotion practices in positions of power in the workplace is also one sort of solution. Okay. That's it. So much for sexual harassment. We'll pick up next time with the gender wage gap. All right. Hope you guys are staying safe, and that you're ready to make it through the end of this crazy fucking semester we've got here. We're almost there. We're almost there. Okay, bye. Till next time.